Thank you all. I'm not talking about Aaron Burr this year. I'm glad to be invited back, but I thought, I didn't want you to think that that was all I ever talked about. But since the topic had to be related to New Jersey, I gave that some thought, and I had what I hope was a brilliant inspiration to talk about Benjamin Franklin, whom you all know, and his son William, who was the last royal governor of New Jersey. So New Jersey will figure a lot in what I have to say today. And not too many people, even New Jerseyans, even know about William Franklin. And I'm going to talk about the relationship between Ben and his son William. And I'll give you the spoiler alert right off the bat. And then we'll kind of take you through how we get there. But when the American Revolution comes, as you all know, Ben obviously is on the rebellious side, but William stays loyal to England, and this caused, of course, a huge breach in their relationship, which had previously been very close, and they never do reconcile. So they become totally alienated from each other, so there's a sad element to it, definitely, from a family perspective. I used to talk about this with my students when I taught a course on colonial America, and they always found it really interesting that they could relate, on a personal level, on a family level, so I thought you would enjoy it too. So without any further ado, I want to aim for like maybe 45, 50 minutes of me talking, and then I hope we have time for Q&A and discussion. Does that sound okay, Deborah? Fine. Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Well, I think most people obviously know about Ben Franklin. I always think he would enjoy this, that his name became a slang expression for the $100 bill. I think wherever he is, he likes that. But in any case, as I say, not many people know about William. Just very, very quickly, Ben is born in 1706, dies in 1790. He's born in Boston, and he's, some of you may know this or vaguely remember it. As a teenager, he's apprenticed to his older brother, who's a printer and runs a newspaper called the New England Current. And Ben is apprenticed to him to learn the printing and newspaper trade. Which he does, and Ben, by the way, wrote an autobiography. Maybe some of you may have read it, or it's very entertaining. And he talks about this in there. But he falls out with his brother, and he runs away before his apprenticeship is up. He runs away. He's apprenticed at 12. He runs away at 16. The apprenticeship still had 5 more years to go. Interestingly, that was a felony. That was a crime. To break your terms of apprenticeship. So he actually has to stay away from Massachusetts for some years until he can pay off his brother and then come back to visit his family. But he winds up, 16 years old, he winds up in Philadelphia, and he decides to make his fortune there and his home there. And he does so very successfully. By the time he's in his early 40s, he's highly successful and highly wealthy. In fact, let me just look at, does everybody have a handout? Yeah. The bottom picture, that's William. That's the only known portrait we have of him. Okay, yeah. This was taken, he would have been, William would have probably been in like maybe 50s, and that portrait was done in England. Ben, I bet you haven't seen that one before, have you? Okay, that's why I picked it, because it's so different. We're all used, there are a lot of different portraits of Ben, but they all look the same. They're all from when he's older, and he's bald on top, but he has the long gray hair, right? Yeah, even, if you're all carrying around $100 bills, you can pull that out and look at it. We're all familiar with that Ben, but I picked this one just because it's so different. And we're used to seeing Ben as basically an old man. But this is the youngest rendition of Ben that we have. He would have been, say, like late 30s, maybe 40-ish, when this portrait is painted. So that's young Ben, as young as we can get him. But also notice, what's he wearing? The wig. The wig, yeah. Very interesting. We never see him. Old Ben never wears a wig.
All the elders did, right?
Well, what's he trying to prove with the wig? It's a status. It's a status symbol. It's saying, look at me, I'm rich and powerful, and famous, even though I'm only 40-ish. But the wig is definitely the status symbol, and it's just so interesting that Ben at that age, that he's posed that way, shows that he still cares about status and his status. Whereas later the old Ben doesn't care at all, but he knows he's got the status then. But I just think it's so interesting because we're so not used to it. So that's why I picked that one. But yeah, very interesting. Young Ben in a wig. Okay. As I say, Ben makes a very nice living for himself. He publishes a newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. He becomes what we call today a media mogul. He buys papers in other colonies and owns them. Yeah. And he also, of course, has by this point written a bestseller, Poor Richard's Almanac. So he's a very wealthy and prominent man. He gets very involved in Pennsylvania politics. There are so many interesting tangents I could have gone on, and I tried to be really self-disciplined. So we'll say a little bit about Pennsylvania politics in a few moments. But Ben gets very involved in Pennsylvania politics. Again, there's just so many interesting trails to follow, and I don't want to get too sidetracked. But let me say a little bit about Ben's wife and the circumstances of his marriage. Ben's wife is named Deborah Reed, R-E-A-D. And they met, there's a funny story he tells in his autobiography when he first arrives in Philadelphia and he spends his last few pennies on buying like these big loaves of bread. And he walks down the street with one under each arm and another in his mouth. And Deborah Reed is standing outside in front of her house and she sees him and laughs. But they do wind up getting married. But again, this is a very interesting story. I'll try to make it real quick. Ben eventually boards with Deborah's family, and they kind of have an understanding. But her parents think they're too young, and they're not really sure when Ben's 18, that he's going to be a success. And when Ben is so the romance doesn't come to anything at that point. Ben goes to England at the age of 18, and he spends 2 years there. He goes to study the latest printing techniques. We look back on that and we think, oh, that it's so primitive, they're printing techniques. But actually printing even then, well, always, a highly technical skill. And new advances are always being made, and Ben wants to go to England and sort of learn printing there and buy some of the latest equipment, he learns to master it and bring that back to Philadelphia. So he's gone 2 years, and then he comes back to find that Deborah Reed has married another man. And he kind of blames himself because he only wrote to her once in the 2 years he was gone, and that was to say he didn't think he'd be back for a while. Okay, but poor Deborah's got herself into a fix. She married a low-down, rotten, dirty scoundrel who abandons her and goes off to the West Indies. His name was John Rogers. And this leaves her, this is just the thing I wanted to mention, this leaves her in a kind of marital limbo. And this affected a lot of women in that day. Okay? Very similar story with Alexander Hamilton's mother in the West Indies. Okay? You marry a no-good guy, he leaves you, but you can't get divorced, or it's well nigh impossible to get divorced. And he may show up or send a letter from time to time just to let you know he's still alive, so you can't have him declared dead. Oh, God. And this guy was so rotten, he would actually do that. Like to make sure she didn't divorce him or have him declared dead, he'd send a letter, or he'd even make an appearance. Oh, look at me, I'm not dead. And then go off again. So as I say, she's in this like no-win situation. She can't, at least legally, she can't remarry. That's the problem. But there was something called common law marriage, and it affected a lot of women. And that's what Ben and Deborah do. They have a little, they actually have a little party to announce their marriage, and then they, he gets housing for them. They move in together, and that's it. And everybody seems to accept it, and understand that it's not her fault. Okay, yeah, she's the victim of a scoundrel, and you had to do what you had to do. But it's kind of interesting that it actually wasn't frowned upon, my Episcopalian friends will be interested in this. Deborah was an Anglican. She and her family belonged to Christ Church in Philadelphia, and she was very devout and went to church regularly. And this was perfectly the new arrangement with Ben. Nobody looked down on it, and it was perfectly acceptable to the church. And she continued to go to church and take communion, and that was just, they accepted that she was in that situation, and that was okay. Which kind of that surprised me when I learned that. That it really wasn't looked down upon or frowned upon. And everybody accepted her. She was called Mrs. Franklin, and their children were considered legitimate. But this brings us to William, okay, Ben's son, our governor-to-be. William's illegitimate, and I want to mention this because it's an interesting kind of historical dilemma. To this day, no one knows who William's mother was. Although undoubtedly Ben had a very tight circle of friends who knew. And there have been a lot of theories about who his mother might be. Again, these are all interesting trails I could go down. So I'll try to keep this brief. Some historians actually think Deborah was his mother, but that really makes no sense because the illegitimate stigma, if you will, stays with him his whole life. But if Deborah was his mother, that wouldn't be the case. Even if he was born a little early, no one would care. But he wouldn't be considered illegitimate. That's the point. That seems to me a theory that just goes nowhere. Deborah's obviously not his mother. Some think, well, it might have been a prostitute. Ben talks in his autobiography, admits that before he married Deborah, he consorted with what he called low women. But this doesn't, if you think about it, this doesn't make a lot of sense either, because how would he be sure he was William's father? Okay, yeah, and that's the one thing we do know. Ben has no doubt that he is William's father. So the likelihood that it's a low woman seems highly unlikely, because there would always be that question mark, right, of who the father actually was. But Ben is in no doubt that William is his son. The theory that appeals to me the most and conforms with the facts as we know them is this, that William's mother, again, it's only a theory, but I'm giving it to you as what I think is the most plausible one, a married woman with a husband who travels a lot. And that was not unusual. Philadelphia is a port city, and men, who went on business trips, it's not like an overnight or a couple days, okay? They would travel to England or down to the Caribbean all the time. And that's a trip of months, and sometimes they would stay for a year or so. So this seems plausible that the hypothetical married woman wouldn't be able to pass off a baby as being her husband's because the timing would not fit, okay? If the husband is away, well, this kid can't be mine. So the thought is, as I say, it seems plausible to me. Ben and, again, a very tight circle of friends want to spare this woman humiliation as well, right? Spirit her off out into the country somewhere under any excuse. She needs to recover from an illness, or she's got a sick relative she needs to take care of, or whatever, She has the baby, it goes to a nursemaid, and interestingly, this is all, again, we don't even know when William's actually born, but probably around 1730. But Deborah is willing to accept him into the household. He's still a little baby. Deborah is willing to accept him into the household and be his mother. So it's kind of interesting dynamics there. So many odd things with the Franklin family. We're just scratching the surface here. But that's one. But seems to be nobody seems to know, or those who do aren't talking, like who the mother actually is. But everybody in Philadelphia seems to know William is not Deborah's. Okay. Ben and Deborah, though, do have 2 children of their own. One is a little boy that they named Francis and called Frankie, which always kind of makes me laugh, like Frankie Franklin. But poor little Frankie dies at the age of 4 of smallpox. Yeah, and Ben blames himself. He even talks about this in his autobiography because, and again, how current does this sound? There was an inoculation thing over smallpox. It was still very controversial. Some people were all for it. Some people were anti-vaxxers of the smallpox vaccination. The sad irony is Ben was pro-vaccination, but he just never got around to having it done for Frankie. And so he blames himself and carries a lot of guilt with that. But poor little Frankie dies at the age of 4. They later do have a daughter, Sarah, who was called Sally, and she was born when? In 1743. She's in good health. She grows up and gets married to a man named Richard Bache, B-A-C-H-E, and we'll mention Sally later. So those are the only children in the household. I want to go through. Wow, look at the time already. I have to go through this pretty quickly. Ben totally dotes on William. He was called Billy in the family. He even gets him, what's the ultimate thing you ask Santa? A pony? Ben gets, yeah, right, William actually gets the pony. Yeah, for Christmas. Pretty cool, huh? Ben, as I say, Ben totally dotes on him. Sends him to what we would consider like a posh high school. But William has no interest in going to college or in taking over the printing and publishing business. One of the earlier phases of the French and Indian War is occurring at this time. We're in the 1740s. Remember, the French still own Canada. William goes into the army as a volunteer. Ben already has, excuse me, like a lot of sway with prominent people, and he gets, William is 16 years old, but he's commissioned as an officer in like a volunteer militia unit attached to the British Army. William never sees combat, but he does participate in some really long and arduous marches up to Canada and out west, in really tough conditions. But he does well, and he would have liked to make that a career, but Americans couldn't get regular commissions in the British Army. So William sort of, just adjusts to that and doesn't make a deal out of it. But interestingly, same thing happened to George Washington. Yeah, and he bore a resentment over that for years. But William, it just seems to roll off William. Ben goes back to England. Let me sure I got my years here, years straight here. Ben goes to William in 1757. Ben goes to England, to London in 1757. So William would have been about 17 then. And Ben stays for 3 years. Why does he go at this time? He goes because he's an agent, that was the word used, for the Pennsylvania Assembly. An agent, I think a word we would use to describe it would be a lobbyist. Okay, he's a paid lobbyist for the all the colonies had this. For the Assembly. The Assembly was elected. Each colony had their own assembly, and it was they were elected. Okay, it kind of functioned like a mini House of Commons, if you will. All right. And the Pennsylvania Assembly hires Ben. They do pay him a salary, and he goes to England. So it's sort of like an ambassador in a way too, but essentially a lobbyist. He takes William with him. William goes to what we would call like law school in England. It's called the Inns of Court. I don't know if that expression's familiar to anybody. They still exist. It was kind of like posh law school. And then you stay affiliated with that, your particular one, like for your whole life. It's like a career thing. So William becomes a barrister in England. And he follows the family tradition of fathering an illegitimate son. Again, we don't know the lady's name, but William doesn't deny it, and William acknowledges the boy as his own, and Ben acknowledges William as the father. The boy's name was William Temple Franklin, and he was known as Temple. So I will call him that to distinguish between the two Williams. But interestingly, Ben sort of takes over and pays for Temple's upkeep. Temple is given to a foster family, and Ben pays all the expenses. We begin to see, just a side remark, Ben interferes with William's life a lot. And this is going to be, you won't be surprised, right, like a source of resentment as William gets older. Okay, so, but for the meantime, Temple stays with the foster family in London, and Ben foots all the bills, okay? Ben comes back to America in 1762. William stays behind just for a little while, and William gets appointed as my thing keeps slipping, as Royal Governor of New Jersey. So let's talk about that for a little bit and how that comes about. Because William's still very young. I think we'd all concede, like William, again, he's like 31, 32. As I say, we never know when his actual birthday is. But wouldn't we sort of concede that that's kind of pretty young to get an appointment like this, especially and a guy with no political experience whatsoever? But there's an interesting story behind it. In 1760, the king, George II, died, and he was succeeded by his grandson, George III. It was customary then, we just had a death of a monarch a year ago, it was customary then that every royal official, from top to the lowliest, resign, hand in the resignation. And the assumption was, the vast majority of them would simply be reappointed by the new king. So the then governor of New Jersey, a guy named Josiah Hardy, resigns thinking he's going to be reappointed. It turns out he was not. I'm not sure why, but obviously he had ticked off somebody. Another person was appointed who turns it down because he wants to, his name was Thomas Pownall, he wants to stay in England and run for Parliament, become an MP. So then, okay, let's go with this William Franklin kid. And it was I don't want to say, it's not so much a controversial appointment, but as I say, it is a little odd because he's so young and so inexperienced. Again, the question is, does Ben interfere and pull strings to get William this appointment? Ben denies that, but strong possibility, yeah. And who's surprised? It's kind of Ben's pattern with William's life. He's always like directing behind the scenes what's happening. But Ben he's a master, again, I'm using current words we use. He's a master, Ben now, is a master at what we call networking. Ben spends his time in England pretty much schmoozing with everybody who's powerful and important and can help him someday. And that was part of what the job, I'm not saying that in a negative note, I'm not putting a negative connotation on it. That's part of what the job of an agent requires. But he also uses it to help his own son. But in any event, William gets the appointment, and he's thrilled. William also gets married and brings his new wife, but not the kid yet, to America. Let me just explain this, again, very brief and simple. Who do the royal governors answer to? Okay? That's a great title, isn't it? Royal Governor. Yeah, how cool is that? I know. You're not just a plain old governor of New Jersey. You're the royal governor. But they're answerable, the royal governors are answerable to a government bureau in England called the Board of Trade that kind of oversees all the colonies. And the president of the Board of Trade is also a cabinet member called the Secretary of State for the Southern Department. And that included all the colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Later, they kind of divvy that up, and there's a separate Secretary of State for America. So William has, bureaucratic duties. He has to send reports to these guys, and it's a difficult job. Ben Franklin, okay, he famously called New Jersey, anybody know? A barrel tapped at both ends. Meaning, of course, New York City and Philadelphia, which is still true to this day, right? Sports, Taylor ham or pork roll, it's all there. They were originally called East Jersey and West Jersey. And, in fact, at one time, they were two separate colonies. And then they're sort of that only lasted about 15 years or so. They were forcibly reunited in 1703 and became a royal colony. But they had some hangovers persisted. One was that there were two capitals. The capital of East Jersey was Perth Amboy, the capital of West Jersey was Burlington. And after they're reunited again, neither side kind of wants to give up. So the governor used to have to alternate each year. The New Jersey Assembly, we have an assembly too, they meet 1 year in Perth Amboy, another year in Burlington. So a lot of traveling going on. Yeah. But another interesting facet, does Ben have an ulterior motive in seeing William become governor of New Jersey? Probably, yeah. Yeah, he does. And again, I don't want to get off on too big a tangent, but I have to explain this simply. Pennsylvania was not, strictly speaking, a royal colony. It was a proprietorship. The Penn family owned it. Okay, from what I think everybody's heard of William Penn, who was the founder of Pennsylvania. But because it was a proprietorship, the proprietor owns all the land and can sell it, rent it, bequeath it in his will, and charge all kinds of fees and taxes for all kinds of stuff. Okay, but the proprietors don't pay taxes themselves. And by taxes, I'm talking about property taxes. Okay. The Penn family, William Penn is long dead, but it went to his son, and then his son has sons. Ben Franklin hates the Penns, and the Penns hate Franklin. Okay, he thinks they're grifters, that they live off the fruits of the colony but don't contribute anything. They don't pay taxes. He hates them, and he thinks they're corrupt. And he wants them gone, and he wants New Jersey to be made a royal colony. Wants Pennsylvania to be made a royal colony, where they're like directly from London. Okay, yeah. So in fact, Ben becomes obsessed with his hatred of the Penns. But one reason that he wants William governor of New Jersey is he thinks it's an ally right on his flank, so to speak, and that this will somehow help him in his crusade against the Penns. So there's just a lot going on here. I'm going to, again, in the interest of time, we don't need to get into these things in detail, but say the next 12 years, say from 63 to 75, when the American Revolution breaks out, obviously relations between the colonies and England are getting worse and worse. And this puts both Ben and William, especially William, are in a tricky spot, and their relationship is going to was previously very, very close, going to start to fracture. Okay. One historian pointed this out, and I think it's very interesting, and I agree with it. From William's point of view, and he's now, he's in his 30s, he is thrilled to be the governor of New Jersey. He thinks this is the greatest thing that's happened to him so far in his life. And he's actually, we know from letters, he is actually hoping to be kind of promoted to a more prestigious colony than New Jersey. He's thinking New Jersey might be a stepping stone to something higher. It's not going to happen, but it's understandable that he would think that. So he thinks, well, if I do a good job here and the Board of Trade is happy with me, maybe I can get a better locale. But William, but despite that, the fact that he is at least initially looking for higher things, whatever that might be, William loves being governor of New Jersey. Excuse me. And I have a great quote here that William views his governorship, it's quote, his sole source of income, identity, and purpose. He also doesn't want to alienate the father, whom he loves. But things are starting to happen politically between Parliament and the colonies. Sorry, a little dry. The king is not involved in this at all. It starts out as a quarrel, excuse me, and then becomes a shooting war in 1775. And it's about Parliament. Initially, it's not about the king at all. It's about Parliament. As things we start to get some little crises, and then they become big crises in the late 1760s and early 70s. Is everybody with me so far? I hope I'm not flinging out too many dates. Okay, thank you, thanks. Okay, yeah. I'll just mention one. The first big crisis, the Stamp Act in 1765. This was the first attempt, this was very controversial, because it was the first attempt of Parliament in England to directly tax the colonies. Okay? Yeah, the colonies did not normally pay taxes to England at all. They paid taxes in their own colony where they lived, or if you own, which some wealthy people did, they might own property in another colony, but they'd have to pay property taxes there, just like you would if you own property in another state. But that was within the colony, and each colony had an elected assembly. Okay? But for Parliament to directly tax the colonists, the tax was going to be on everything paper, all paper products. Okay? Newspapers, writing papers, stamps, playing cards, any kind of government document was no good unless it had a stamp on it. Okay? And of course, you would have to pay for the stamp. All right? So this becomes very controversial. Parliament's sort of blindsided in a way by the reaction. They don't think they think the colonists are just going to say, oh yeah, fine. But there are protests, and some of them get very violent. The ground zero for violent protest was Boston. Okay. And now William, as the royal governor, he's trying to keep the peace on both sides. He's against the Stamp Act, as was Ben. But Ben's so obsessed with the pens, he's not really paying attention. But William has to pay attention. But he's against the Stamp Act, and he tries very delicately in his letters back saying, this is ill-advised, okay? But at the same time, he can't be seen, he doesn't want London to see him as losing control and having riots or anything like that in New Jersey. That would reflect very badly on William, right? Yeah. So William realizes he has to walk a very fine line here. And again, at this point, it's kind of odd, knowing how involved in the American Revolution Ben will later become, it's kind of odd how at this point, like Ben's not really worried about this. He's obsessed, he's single-minded obsessed with getting the pens out. Yeah, it's very odd, it's very odd. But William has already realizes he's walking a tightrope. He needs to keep the peace in New Jersey, and above all, he wants to keep his job, which he loves. And and it gives his life meaning. Yeah. So, things are okay for a while between Ben and William. But the problems with Parliament are getting worse. The Stamp Act is actually repealed in less than a year. It was such a bad idea. But Parliament's now been humiliated. They had to backtrack. So they're going to try other taxes. I'm not going to get into this all. Tea is included, a few other products. The colonists are supposed to pay taxes on. The British government makes the decision, in hindsight, we can see how obviously a bad decision it is. They actually send British troops, regulars, to Boston to keep the peace. Because again, they're just like totally out of control with violence. All deliberately planned by Sam Adams. Okay, yeah, his fingerprints are all over this, but they can never touch, they can never get him to touch, yeah, they can't touch him. He's very clever. But you know, there are going to be further incidents. The Boston Massacre, you've heard of that, or maybe if you've been to Boston, there's a little plaque in the sidewalk when British troops fire on Americans. They were admittedly they were provoked, but once the gun fires, you know, the situation really ratchets up. So things are getting worse and worse between the colonies and London. And as I say, William's trying to walk this tightrope. So far, like, New Jersey isn't really violent. There are some protests, but they're not riots like you have in Boston. But still, William is worried, understandably, about what's coming next. There seems to be Parliament like providing grievance upon grievance. Ben goes back to England in 1764 and stays 10 years. Yeah. Again, as the agent for Pennsylvania, but he's now the agent of 3 other colonies as well. New Jersey, no surprise. Georgia, duh, where'd that come from? And Massachusetts. Yeah, and it's Ben's taken that job as agent of Massachusetts that makes it unavoidable for him to start paying attention and kind of let the pens go. He never does get rid of the pens. The American Revolution gets rid of the pens, but Ben never gets rid of them. But yeah, things are obviously becoming worse and worse. What's interesting about Ben's 10 years in England, and again, he is networking constantly. He's very popular. He has a big social life, okay? Poor Deborah's back in America, you know, dealing with all the household stuff and family stuff. He's not around. Daughter Sally gets married. Ben's not around. William, in effect, becomes like almost like the substitute head of the family for the, you know, he takes care. He makes sure Deborah gets taken care of when she's ill and she's getting older, and so he's like the head of the Franklin household too, the head of Ben's household. Of course, Ben's gone. Ben always has something else going on. You know, he's never home. The turning point for Ben, and again, I'm just going to go over this quickly, is the Boston Tea Party. This occurs in December of 1773. I'm sure you all know the rough outlines of the story. It's like 350 caskets of tea they're in loose tea in wooden crates. They're smashed open and tossed into the harbor. It said that, like, by today's numbers, that would be worth like $2 million worth of tea. When the news gets, it takes usually like minimum 2 months for news to get back to England. When Parliament finds out about this, whoa, they go nuts. Or at least the Prime Minister, Lord North, and the cabinet go nuts. And they're going to punish Boston. Now, Ben has nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party, right? He's already been in England, okay, for years, but at this point. But by the odd circumstance of timing, Ben's sort of the Massachusetts guy on the spot, and he kind of gets blamed for it, or not blamed directly, but indirectly. Like, why is Massachusetts totally out of control? Yeah. And Parliament's going to punish Massachusetts. Well, punish the port of Boston. They close the port. Nothing's going in or out except by land. But Boston made its living off the sea. There were other punishments as well. But that was the main one, was to simply close down the port and hope to starve out the people of Boston. So it's pretty draconian punishment. Yeah, Ben is called in to testify. This would be almost like a congressional hearing. Okay, yeah. The only thing lacking was TV. But an artist was there to paint it. So we actually have a painting of Ben being cross-examined. And they hold the hearing in this room called the cockpit. So dramatic. Yeah, the cockpit, yeah. All right, where cockfights take place. Yeah, and Ben is screamed at, totally humiliated. This, for Ben personally, this is the turning point. Up to this point, he has actually been either indifferent or even defending Parliament. Okay? Yeah. But here he's being blamed, and the Attorney General, a guy named Wedderburn, really goes also nuts. You would have thought TV was there. He was playing to the cameras. Maybe he was playing to the artist, I don't know. But Wedderburn just goes after him and after him. And Ben, his policy is he's not arguing back, dignified silence. Wow. Yeah. But for Ben, that is the turning point. And as we're going to see, if you haven't guessed already, Ben has, as congenial as he could be, he has a really, if you cross him, he is unforgiving. Wow. Yeah. And so he's not going to forgive the British government for this horrible humiliation by people he knew personally, and had been socializing with and dining with for years. Again, it was sort of the bad luck of timing, but yeah. Yeah, so Ben, and then to add insult to injury, Ben is fired from a job that he loved. Some of you, I'm sure, know this. He was the postmaster of North America.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he was really proud of that and proud of how efficiently he had taken over the Postal Service and made it run. And he said, yes, he could guarantee you would get a letter from Philadelphia to Boston in 3 days. And of course, wise guys say, well, it's takes 3 days today. But I don't know if that's fair or not. But Ben prided himself on being an efficient manager. And this was also like an unforgivable thing to fire him from this job that he was so proud of. Yeah, everybody's playing, bringing out their brass knuckles now. So Ben comes back in 1774. The shooting war actually begins in April of 1775. That's we consider the beginning of the revolution, meaning when guns are fired on both sides. Then immediately, the Continental Congress already exists as a body, and Ben, of course, is immediately, as soon as practically he sets foot in Philadelphia, he's immediately elected or sent, as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Now, here's the crux of the fight between Ben and William. Right? Ben wants William to resign as governor of New Jersey and join the rebellious side. Again, it's not quite a shooting war yet, but it's very close to it. And William refuses. Yeah, and he even this is pretty gutsy for William, who's always kind of a very docile son. William quotes Ben's own words back at him, because yes, Ben had once advised William. That if you have especially a government job, but really at any job where you have bosses and you're having some sort of quarrel with them, don't resign, make them fire you. Yeah. And William throws this back at him. And, Dad, you told me, never resign, make them fire you. Well, I'm not resigning. And Ben is furious. That's maybe like the single thing that really kills their relationship. And William never does resign. He never does resign. And Ben is just, as I say, Ben is just furious, and considers this a personal betrayal. Yeah. And I'm sure you can imagine all the guilt trip being thrown around. Son, after all I did for you, you have this job because of it? Yeah. It gets very, very ugly between them. And of course, whatever happened to William's son, Temple? Well, Ben brings him back to America with him when he returns in 1774. Temple is about, at this point, he's like 15, 16, somewhere in there. Again, we don't know when Temple was born either. But he's somewhere around that age. But it's like Ben takes over running, like being the dad of Temple, and won't let William do it. So this is also obviously going to create a lot of familial stress, is it not? And in a way, you have to feel sorry for poor Temple. He's like the ping pong ball between his father and his grandfather. And Ben lets him go visit William from time to time, but then always wants him back. Ben directs his education. And again, just one example. William would like Temple to go to college in New York City at what is today Columbia University. It was then called King's College. Ben vetoes that. No, he can't go there. It's a hotbed of Toryism. He's going to stay in Philadelphia with me and go to the, what's today University of Pennsylvania, was then called the College of Philadelphia. So, I mean, it was like William has nothing to say about his own son. In the meantime, William's wife, this poor long-suffering lady, they never had any children, but she is thrilled to learn of Temple's existence and wants to, like, bring him into the fold and be his mom. Ben won't allow it. Ben won't allow it. He's going to run Temple's life. And Temple has nothing to say about it either. And Ben's footing the bills for Temple's upkeep, you know. So, but it's a very awkward, and I say it becomes at certain points really even kind of nasty. So you wonder if, like the governorship of New Jersey, that's all William has. He doesn't even really have his own child. But situation goes from bad to worse with that. Let's see. Yeah. Just a sidelight on the way the British treated Ben, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Some historians have pointed out, and this makes sense to me too, that by humiliating Ben that day in the cockpit, in hindsight, that was a really, really stupid thing to do, because the British government alienates probably the one guy in America who maybe could have negotiated some kind of deal or arrangement or peace treaty or something. And that's sort of plausible, because Ben actually had a plan going back to French and Indian War days. Maybe some of you have seen this famous cartoon. I'm sure you have, Dan. The snake chopped up into pieces, and you've seen it? Yeah, and each one, you know, is a colony. And I think it says unite or die. So Ben was already thinking about a plan, and this is back in the 1750s and 60s, of uniting the colonies and having their own parliament here, like an American parliament, but they would be loyal to the king. So it would be like we would become Canada. But that was Ben's plan. And you know, from the British point of view, that was a really stupid thing to alienate Ben. The one guy, and I would agree with this, the one guy who possibly could have pulled it off and kept Sam Adams, you know, as a distant, kind of shut him down as a troublemaker and work out something. But wow, when they go after Ben, again, he is not forgiving. They've gone after the wrong guy, and he goes totally all in for rebellion. And interesting, one thing I find fascinating, I find Ben so fascinating. I don't claim to be an expert on him, but he is fascinating. Like if there was time travel, and we could bring Ben to the present age, he would adjust very quickly. Yeah. Here's what he does. As I'm sure many of you know, Continental Congress will send him to France to kind of negotiate an alliance, where he does some of his best schmoozing and networking. But before he goes, for about a year or so, as soon as, again, a fighting war starts, Ben has a lot of contacts in France too, often in like the scientific community, because they were all working on electricity at the experiments and stuff at the same time. Yeah, here's what Ben does. Ben organizes, while he's still in Philadelphia, sets up a dummy corporation and a money laundering operation so that the French can actually help us, but you know what we say, plausible deniability? Yeah, because the French government, which is still an absolute monarchy, okay, they don't want to help us. They're very tempted because they want revenge on England for losing Canada in 1763. But they also, they're being cautious, at least for a while. And so there's no formal alliance with the French till 1777. But Ben's got the money laundering thing and the dummy corporation going right off the bat, and they're selling us guns on the sly. And only Ben could have thought of that, or had the chops to arrange that. So again, bad mistake on Britain's part to alienate Ben. And then, of course, Ben will be sent to France to negotiate a treaty, which he does. Interestingly, when he goes to France, I'm just looking for the year. Do I have the year? Yeah. Well, not at the tip of my fingers. But he takes his 2 grandchildren with him. Now it's 2 grandchildren. Ben takes Temple with him, who's 15, and he takes Sally's son, whose name is Benjamin Franklin Bache. He was only 7 years old, and Ben takes them with him to France. And then, of course, as you all know, Ben stays in France quite a while. He's a huge hit socially. The ladies love him. Especially maybe you've seen paintings. There's some paintings, he's wearing like this big fur hat. Yeah, it's like he's on the steppes of Russia or something. But yeah, that was a huge hit with the French ladies, the hat. Yeah, the relations go from bad to worse. There was one time before Ben goes to France, he goes to Perth Amboy, where William and his wife were. That house is, I have never been there, but they fixed it all up, the governor's mansion. It's called the Proprietary House. That was where William and his wife lived. He's still governor of New Jersey, even though, New Jersey's kind of in shambles. But, we'll get back to William in a minute, but I was just going to mention this about Ben. Ben goes to visit him one time. I think this is either late 75 or early 76. And they get into an argument, and it was so loud that all the neighbors heard it. And again, Ben will not make up. I suppose an amateur psychologist, or maybe a professional one, might say, well, Ben uses Temple as a kind of like a weapon of revenge against his son. That aspect of it's very sad. William, though, he's still in the governor's mansion, at least for a while, and but he loses control of New Jersey, at least politically. And I find this very interesting. The New Jersey Assembly, okay, again, remember they're elected, they kind of reconstitute themselves as now joining the rebel side, and they call themselves the Provincial Congress, okay? And William goes, and we even have the exact date, December 5th, 1775, and this turns out sort of disastrous for William. He goes to address the, whatever you prefer to call it, General Assembly or Provincial Congress, to beg them not to affiliate with the Continental Congress. Okay, there's still a little wiggle room here, not much, but a little. And he goes in person to address them, to beg them. Guess what they tell him? No dice, Governor, no dice. And he, as one historian said, that's the moment, even though he clings to his title, that's the moment he loses New Jersey, and he knows it. He now has really no control. He's got an empty title, okay? And he still has a house to live in, but for not for very long. Not surprising. Oh, this is a statement of William's. Nothing will ever influence me to forget or neglect the duty I owe my country, nor the most heinous rage of the intemperate zealots induce me to swerve from the duty I owe His Majesty. Okay? He's not resigning. The other interesting anecdote is that at another meeting, some members of the Provincial Council go to William to kind of cross-examine him because they're not sure what to do with him. All right, do they arrest him? Do they just leave him be? Do they, it's sort of, it's awkward. And he won't leave. He won't leave, so nobody knows what to do with him. But they have another, verbal set to, and a man named John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton and a Presbyterian minister from Scotland, who is a keen supporter of the rebellion, Witherspoon, and this is very out of character, that's why I'm mentioning it, but it's such an interesting anecdote, human nature, huh? Witherspoon, because William, he's sticking to this. I took an oath to His Majesty, and you're going to have to kill me. I'm never resigning. Well, they don't want to kill him. That would probably backfire. But Witherspoon loses his temper, infuriated, and calls William, ready for it, a base-born bastard. Yeah. And that's a very sore spot with William, a little double meaning there. Yeah, that always surprises me that Witherspoon would lose his temper like that, but he did. I guess William really infuriated him. But I always just find that very interesting. Witherspoon, of course, later becomes famous as being the mentor of James Madison, and they were very close. But yeah. Anyway, William is in fact finally arrested. Ben does nothing. Ben does not intervene at all to do anything to help William. Little harsh, huh? Yeah. William is arrested, and he's taken, I'm not quite sure why, but he's taken to Hartford, Connecticut. And he's kind of under house arrest. He has a lot of freedom, but the rebel leadership in Connecticut finds out that William has been trying to make contact with British authorities, and when they find that out, they put him in solitary confinement. Yeah, for 8 months. Okay, all right. September 76 is when Ben leaves for France, taking the 2 grandsons. He also says, Ben says about Temple, speaking of himself, he has rescued a valuable young man from the danger of being a Tory. Okay. Okay. I'll wrap it up. I'd love to hear some of your questions and comments. William, the war ends, and William goes back. He's let loose from jail, from his solitary confinement, and in the meantime learns his poor wife has died. This poor woman, she was so long suffering, and sounds like a really nice lady, and it's sad. And William eventually he goes to New York City. Which is still being held by the British until 1783. But eventually William goes back to England. But he has a really sad life there because the people in Britain look on him askance. Oh, he's Ben Franklin's son. Never mind all that William has sacrificed, for what turned out to be a losing cause. But he remains in England the rest of his life. He does remarry. And he has, let me get you the date of this. It's sad. They have Ben on his way back from France with Temple stops in England to visit William. This is in 1785, as Ben and the 2 grandsons are preparing to come home. But the meeting does not go well. Ben wants, you got to shake your head. This could be like a soap opera miniseries. Ben wants William to apologize and admit he was wrong. William refuses. He says he wants to reconcile with Ben, but he will not apologize because in his mind, his beliefs, he did nothing wrong, and he says to Ben he would do it again. Yeah, okay. So nobody's backing down here. Ben is furious, and he says, referring to this later in the letter, nothing has hurt me so much and affected me with such keen sensations as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son, and not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me in a cause wherein my good fame, fortune, and life were all at stake. Ben dies in 1790, never forgiving his son. And William continues to write these sort of sad letters, like he wants to make up with Ben, but he won't apologize. William does remarry. in 1788, and the new wife, Mary de Evelyn, dies in 1812. I'll just wrap up. Temple turns in to a ne'er-do-well. And maybe you can all maybe understand why. He does go back to England, where he basically chases women, gets drunk, runs up debts. Yeah, but he never kind of recovers from what happened to him, and it is sad. Temple fathers an illegitimate daughter this time. Yes, he does, named Ellen, and William takes her in. Temple bolts to France, and he stumped whoever Ellen's mother is, I don't know, but Temple stumped her, and he has a new lover, and he goes to France. So William and Temple never see each other again, although they do exchange letters. You wouldn't say they're estranged, really, but Temple is just kind of out of control at this point with the drinking and the gambling and so on. And Temple keeps promising. William begs him to come for a visit, and Temple keeps promising, yeah, I'll come, but he never does. William dies in 1814. His sister Sally had already died in 1808. Ellen did marry and have a child, but the child died. So there are no descendants of Ben Franklin through William's line. However, there are descendants of Ben Franklin, many of them still alive today, and they all come from his daughter Sally, who had several children. Yeah. I don't know if they have a Franklin Descendants Society or not, but I checked on the internet. Yeah, they are descendants. But again, they all come from Sally. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. It's sad, it's sad though, isn't it? I mean, the family dynamics here, it's like there's a colonial, dysfunctional family. And it's several generations, how these kinds of things do persist. Yes, sir, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
In the cockpit,
yeah.
Lord North and his group looked at Ben Franklin as a wealthy man, and they sense, in a way, this anger that he's a commoner with all this money. Did that have played into the relationship?
Oh, I think I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's quite plausible, yes. Because Franklin is, and he's a self-made man, He's not an aristocrat who inherited it. Yeah, he's a self-made man, and we call him today, he's like a multimillionaire. Just the royalties from Poor Richard's Almanac alone, and as I say, he owns several newspapers. There very well could be that kind of jealousy factor, yeah.
The Industrial Revolution, in a way, there's a whole class of people coming to the fore.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Who did Ben leave all his money to?
I guess. Well, not William. That's for sure. No. I'm guessing the daughter. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
I had read that he left at least some money in a trust that actually lasted until the early 1900s.
Really?
For the education and the training of apprentices in the trades.
Wow.
That could be, because he was even though he had a bad apprentice experience himself with his brother, which again is just so typical of Ben, but yeah, he was very much, that's a great point. I'm sure he did. He also founded the, which is still going today, I'm trying to think what they call it, American Philosophical Society. Yeah, he was very into that, and being, as I say, he was the role model for the self-made man. But yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm sure he did. I don't doubt that at all, and I suspect you're quite right there. Yeah, yes, sir, go ahead.
I had heard that Ben Franklin was very critical of people who were not prepared to take on the responsibility of running themselves, almost in a Herbert Spencer tradition. So that I've almost envisioned him, this self-made man, almost like a Scrooge in a way, the Christmas Carol.
I can see that. Yeah. Yeah. He's very impatient with people whom he thinks are lazy, or frittering their advantages away, with drink and gambling and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's a good point. He does, and again, I'm not claiming to be a Ben Franklin expert, although I did do a lot of reading in August and September to prepare for this, yeah. But when he first goes to Philadelphia, and he's 16, and he has literally nothing, and he spends his last pennies on those loaves of bread, but yet he gets a job right away. But if you read about him and what he's doing in those years is, and I think this goes right to your point, he's taking on people who he thinks can help him or who share his same views, but he discards. Like, he goes through a lot of business partners. And for reasons like, well, can't keep him on board anymore. He drinks too much, or he gambles, or he's chasing women all the time. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. He does have this very harsh, kind of condemning side. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, Dan, please.
I just like to make 2 comments. I'm sitting here listening to this, and I realized that Ben Franklin was such a Renaissance man, and I'm just wondering how in the world he could accomplish all he accomplished being part of this dysfunctional family. It's just really amazing to me. And I just wanted to mention something to everybody. If you're interested in Ben Franklin, this past Sunday, the feature article on the Bergen Record newspaper was a sermon that took place in the Washington National Cathedral in September. But the beginning of the sermon refers to Ben Franklin being asked what his religious beliefs are. Wow. And it's fascinating to read it. At the beginning of his column, he actually writes a letter and explains what his religious beliefs are. And if you're interested in Ben Franklin, that would be fun.
Yeah, it's by John Meacham wrote that. Yeah, yeah. Well, the whole topic of Franklin's religious beliefs, that's like 5 or 6 lectures just on that alone, because they do change. They do change. But he's essentially interesting. He's brought up in Boston, and his family is like very strictly Calvinist, Puritan, and very religious. But he seems to reject that at a very young age. And then he kind of goes through an atheist period, and then he kind of becomes, for lack of another term, we'd call him a deist. He believes in the existence of a creator God, but not a personal God. And he's very iffy about Jesus, and that those views can kind of change. He's not sure. Maybe he's a great moral teacher, but he does, at least toward that statement that John Meacham quoted, that's more towards Ben at the end of his life, when you wouldn't say he came back to Orthodox Christianity in any way, but he at least does kind of admit that there's a divine providence that rules the world, and that there will be an eternal reward or punishment. But yeah, that's a very interesting topic. Another interesting thing about that, and Ben talks about this in his autobiography. He is not a churchgoer, and his wife goes to the Anglican church, okay? But Ben is not a churchgoer, but he tells us in his autobiography how he contributes. He's on the membership rolls of the Presbyterian church, but he never goes, but he does pay his pledge every year, okay? And he said the reason he does that, and he says openly, I don't believe anything they teach, but I consider it my civic duty. So he felt, as a leader in the community, this was something he needed to do, and it would help them. Like, they did do good works and help the poor and that kind of thing, and he's all in for that. But this is kind of very, very open. Another thing, which I always find really interesting, because I love the evangelist George Whitefield, whom I love. He's I don't know if any of you've heard of him or not. Really interesting guy. He comes to America numerous times on these like evangelistic tours. And he comes to Philadelphia, and Franklin gets to know him personally, and Franklin tells several what I consider very humorous anecdotes in his autobiography about Whitefield. But it's interesting that he actually bankrolls Whitefield and his trips and so on, and it's not really clear, it's obviously not for religious reasons per se, but there's something about Whitefield as kind of a religious version of Franklin, a self-made man who becomes a very successful evangelist and sells products. Not only his own writings, but, well, they didn't have, the Whitefield tour, the T-shirt, but they sell souvenirs and all kinds of things. So it's really interesting how Ben will bankroll him. But yeah, Ben's religious beliefs, it depends on what year you're looking at. They do change. Yeah, yeah, Diane, please.
Just a curious question.
I'll try.
He created the United States Post Office, but then he was in England for 10 years.
Yeah.
How did he do that?
Well, I guess he was the top guy. I guess he has a good, he hires good people. Because, you're right. He's not there to run it, is he?
Communication then was a little different.
Yeah. That's a great question. That's the only thing I could say. Or I think what he would say, I can leave them. It runs itself. I designed it so beautifully it runs itself. And just my underlings can take care of it.
I was going to say that he designed it. I mean, he doesn't get much credit to it, though. It's terrible.
Well, he wasn't the postmaster anymore. Yeah, he doesn't get that job back. Yeah, anybody else? Deb, good.
Didn't he found UPenn, so would his money have gone there?
Oh, no doubt, some of it. The college. It was first called the College of Philadelphia. But very probably. Wow. Okay, it's 10-2. Wow. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
No, I just think you did a great job.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.